right, so starting our masterclass should be fun. Yeah, so ultimately, once we all choose projects and go through this whole thing, one of the things I was thinking about doing is somehow putting together, say, like a master plan, and we can add that in at the end as well, where we can show all of our projects sitting in a small community together or something like that. And essentially, at the end, with all the renderings and CAD stuff and whatever we're going to produce, we can to some degree create like a mini portfolio, that maybe we even put up on the back wall for everybody to look at to see what we've done and that sort of thing. Um, all right, so moving into some basic vocabulary, and it's more probably about the way that I talk about things, and so therefore just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. Um, everybody knows, if you can see here, that we have some three boxes. And, if I click, everybody knows that this is called a face. If I click a single face, it's a face. If I click a single line, it's a line, or an edge to be more specific. And within SketchUp, if you guys hadn't ever looked at this, there's an edge and face count. And all it's doing is just taking the statistics of your model and it's counting every single edge and counting every single face. And for the entire file. And so where this really comes into play and what's important about this is if you're finding a model that's running really slow, it's because your edge and face count is starting to get astronomical. In general, it's usually not going to be too high, but just know that a single 3D tree potentially can have more edges and faces than a single house, just by the nature of the way, being very organic and, essentially, hundreds of leaves attached to it or whatnot. You can create a very large edge and face count. It's nothing that you really need to be overly concerned with as you're moving through building a model. It's just more for a troubleshooting perspective that you can look at this and really see where, that you're starting to see that you're getting out of control. If you're starting to get to like the hundreds of thousands of these things. Yeah, so then, from this, I think everybody knows, if you left click on a single face, it selects the face. Left click on a single edge, it selects the edge. And there are some additional selection options. So if I double click a face, you can see that it now selects the face and every single binding edge. Do you see that? So one select is the face, double clicking selects face and edges. And if I double click an edge, it selects that edge and all the faces that attach to it. Does it see that? Does it make sense? Now, if I triple click, it's going to select everything that is attached to that face, every single edge and every single face attached to it. And this is something that as we move forward in building the model, there's different times that I select, different ways. And so I just want everybody to be aware of all the different ways that it is possible to select it. Whoops. Was there. Now, yeah, and then everybody obviously knows, this is a group and this is a component, and you guys know the difference between the two. And, if you select all the individual pieces, you right click and say make group, or you can make a shortcut like I have Control G, whatever it is, you guys know, groups and components. Yes. You don't have to. I tend to do that. I'm not sure why, but that I usually do. And I think I know why I do it that way. Simply because if everything here is all individual pieces right now, right? I select everything. I have a shortcut key of Control G to make a group, and for whatever reason, it's just become second nature for me to hit Control G to make a group, right click, make component. But honestly, I can just simply right click and say make component, So it's however you get used to working. And you can even just make a shortcut key like Control G being make group and Control Shift G to make component. And just to have it on the video in case you guys don't know, or again just to have it on here, under preferences, so that'd be window, excuse me, yeah, window preferences, and under shortcuts, this is where you make all of your shortcuts. And we'll probably put together another video as we discussed before, or just a simple list of all the shortcuts that I use. But say for group, like in this filter, I can type in group. And so this is every command that is related to a group. So like edit make group, you can see is my Control G. And so I could do the same thing with component. And if I wanted, I could just simply say add shortcut of Control Shift G and then click add. And now I have Control Shift G as make component. Yeah, so any other questions on groups and components? I mean, it's pretty basic and everybody should hope knows about it, but just wanted everybody to be aware. The next piece of vocabulary that you'll hear me using is the word container. And I've explained to you guys before, but just the way I think about it is just like looking at a piece of Tupperware, that the Tupperware is essentially the shell, and all of this stuff, the faces and edges, is essentially your lunch sitting inside the Tupperware. So this is, every face and edge is basically as low you can go within a group. And there's different ways you can make containers, and that's all that groups and components are just containers, and everybody knows that you can have containers within containers. So like if I copy this group and go into this component, I can have this here. I can make this a group within here. So I can have two groups inside of this one. So you can have as many containers inside of containers. But just know that when I talk about container, that's going to be more of a generic term for both groups and components of just this combined selection, if that makes sense. And again, another basic thing that we've talked about before, but just to have it on the video, we've talked about circles and arcs. And when you draw a circle, if you select the outer edge on the default tray or the entity info, you should see segments, and you can control how many segments that the circle is, so how many segmented lines make up that circle. So in fact, if I make a really big circle, you can see just how segmented this thing is. Like from here to here is a straight line. So if I take this and say from 24 to 48, you can see it's just basically going to knock it in half. 96, 90. When I'm doing a circle for a house, 96 tends to be a really good number. Doing like a tower or something like that in a house. So at that scale, so like the house scale, 96 tends to work really well. If I'm doing something for site planning purposes, like a boundary line has an arc to it. Arcs I usually divide in half. So if, say, my house, and I'll explain that in a second. It's like, where's my house? There we go. So if I have a house and I have this arc that's sitting here, so obviously an arc, for all intents and purposes, is half a circle, even though this doesn't make a complete circle. It's essentially half a circle, where if I were to draw a circle and select this, you see it has 24 edges. If I draw an arc, you can see it comes up with 12. And that's why I'm saying it's half, because it's only giving you half the segments as drawing a circle. So whereas using 96 on a circle for a house level drawing, using 48 for an arc on a house level drawing is what I typically use. So, with that said, if I have a property line, just draw this big piece of property, even does something like that, and maybe the front has this big bow to it or whatever. I'll tend to make this anywhere from 96 to even doubling it. So was that 192 if I'm not mistaken. It really doesn't matter. You just really want a nice smooth arc, especially when you're doing site work, because if not, like an arc comes in at 12, and you'll see if I put this at 12, and I'm coming in, and I've drawn a driveway or something, you can see how big this segment is. I mean, this segment actually measures at 38 feet, which is pretty massive. I mean, that's bigger. I mean, a driveway is only, 12 to 16. So that's why it's really important to have segment control in your arcs. Yes. Say that again. Oh, right. So smoothing does nothing for 2D faces, and it's a great question. So this arc here you can see is at 12, and I'm going to copy this whole thing over, and I'm going to make this one at 96. And if I make this three-dimensional, you can see that they actually look pretty similar, if not identical. But if I have W as my hotkey to show hidden geometry, and you can see immediately the difference. That this has a length, and if you're not seeing it down here in this corner, this has a length of 38 feet almost, a little over 38 feet, versus this is going to be, just under 5 feet. And so even that, at this scale, I probably even knock down to my 192, which would knock it in half, which would make it about 30 inches. So to get specifically to get to your question, you were talking about smoothing. So I have Shift S as my soften edges command, but you can see it pops up here in this default tray. And it's usually preset to 20 degrees, which usually works well for the most part. But I'm gonna knock it down all the way to 0, and those hidden geometry lines you can see are now become no, they're no longer hidden, and you can really now see the smoothing is gone because there is no smoothing. It becomes you can see the shading becomes very distinct, especially right here in this area, where now with these selected, you can then start knocking this up, and this where your softening comes from. So you can see that softening affects the look of your 3D objects, but not your 2D faces. If I were to have take this circle for example, which is set to 96, I'm gonna knock it back down to 12. If I hit Shift S, for my softening, you can see that this whole thing right here is grayed out because it has no effect on 2D shapes. And even pulling this up, looking at it from this perspective, it smooths it out very nicely. But anytime you start getting any kind of three-dimensional look to it, you can really see how rough this looks at this scale. Does that make sense on arcs and circles and all that sort of stuff from a basic standpoint? Yeah. So we'll get into obviously a lot more of this once we get into actually building a house, because there's some other slightly more advanced tricks and techniques that I use whenever I have a tower built into my model. So the project that I choose, I'll try and choose something that has round towers and all that kind of stuff, and really make mine very complex to show some of the pitfalls that you can run into. Yeah, so that's my basic kind of vocabulary run through of different things, specifically looking at containers, groups, components, selecting things, circles, and arcs. The next piece I'll get into, again, still a very basic piece, would be everybody knows like essentially the move, copy, and array commands that are all built into each other. So I'm just going to grab this group. I'm hitting M for move, which should be pretty standard everybody's. And I'm just going to move this out here into space. And so if you want to move it, say 10 feet to the right, you can move anywhere, click, and then type in 10 feet. And if you see down here, whoops, down here on the bottom right, I'm typing in a distance of 120, which is just 120 inches. And so you can see that moved 10 feet. Even if I move it again, and you can see this moves 40 feet, and I click to let go, since that distance is still there, if I don't hit escape and don't do anything else, I can actually type in 120, and it moves it back to its proper move of 120. So there's two ways of doing this. I can either move it, not click, type in, say, 240 for 20 feet, and it moves it 20 feet. You know what? I'm going to give some reference points that might make things a little bit more clear. Yeah, it's just this thing in space. Yeah. So I'm going to scale this down to. So if I grab this, and you see I'm going to move this 20 feet. Each one of these lines is 10 feet. So I'm going to move this 20 feet. I'm going to left click and let go. So I actually moved this item 20 feet. If I come back and type in 120 for 120 inches for 10 feet, I'm going to hit enter. You see that it actually jumps it back to its proper location of 10 feet from the origin. And at this point, again, I still have not hit escape. I still have not entered a new command. I haven't done anything other than type in distances. I can actually come in here and type in 600, which is 600 inches for 50 feet. And you can see it moves it all the way to the end, putting it at 50 feet. Same thing. I can really move this wherever I want. So once you let go, it doesn't necessarily mean it's final. You're still in the command. Another way of looking at this, so that's moving it, placing it, and then adjusting. The other way, if I put it back to its origin, is I can start to move. I cannot left click, so it's still attached, it's still moving, but I'm on the axis I want to move it. I then can enter in a distance, let's say 360 for 30 feet, and it moves it 30 feet. And then just like before, I can come back in and adjust where I'm pushing it. And all I'm doing is just entering in different distances. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's, again, it's all very basic stuff, and I'm sure most of it is what you guys already know. But just to make sure that we are all starting on the same page. So now, the slightly more advanced version of move is copy. So I'm going to move this, and everybody knows that if you hit Control, and I apologize, I don't know what it is on Mac keyboards, but I'm sure you guys do. But if I hit Control, you see the plus. Okay, there you go. If you hit Command, if you see the plus sign pops up, so that means I'm making a copy. And again, I know you guys know this for the move command, but this actually has the same function throughout many commands. So just knowing that that's the move or the copy command. So I can actually move this all the way. In fact, I'm going to move it here, which is 10 feet. So I moved it 10 feet and I let go. I clicked to let go. And at this point, if I want, I can type in 4x, which means it's going to do an array of 4 total. So my original and then 4 copies. So essentially my original, the one I copied, and then 3 additional ones. And again, I haven't hit escape. I haven't entered a new command. I can say, you know what, I really needed 5. So I'm going to hit 5x, enter. And now you can see I have 5. And then similarly, I'm like, nope, you know what, I only wanted 3. I didn't need those last 2. I typed in 3x, and it's still allowing me to continually calculate that. Everybody on board? All right. Now, similarly, if I grab this and I use this for brackets, adding brackets around a house, I'll grab this, go all the way to the end. So I can say this is my A and my Z location. So this is moving 50 feet. And then I can come back and say, you know what? I want to space 5 evenly throughout. So now instead of hitting X, I'm going to type 5 and then slash, like I'm dividing, hitting enter, and you can see that's now evenly spacing them between the two. So again, this works great for brackets. So if I move bracket 1 30 feet all the way to the end for bracket 2, and I know I want them to be 2 feet apart, then I just simply 30 feet divided by 2 is 15. So I just divide it by 15, and I have, my brackets evenly spaced along the house. So that's using essentially the move copy array command linearly. And if you don't know, you can actually do the same thing from a rotational standpoint. So I'm going to get rid of these, and I'm going to grab this one, and I can rotate by the bottom and just simply rotate. And I'm not going to go anywhere near as in depth as the move command because it's the exact same thing. I can click and then come back, type in 60, and it specifies 60-degree angle, 30-degree angle, 15 for 15-degree angle, etc., etc. Similarly, I can copy and say I want it 60 degrees, and then say I want a complete circle, which would be, what is that, 4? I'm sorry, whoops, 4x. Sorry, 5x. 5x would give me a complete circle. So that's, 60, 120, 180, 240, 300, 360. Or I can say I want them every 10 degrees, so I'm going to divide by 6. So now each one of these are 10 degrees apart. So you can do the same thing from a rotational standpoint as you do from a move standpoint, both in your moving, your copy, your multiplying, and your dividing. It's all the exact same thing. Anything else you guys want to see on that? Does that all make sense? Okay. So then the next thing, probably the next biggest foundational piece that you guys are going to need is talking about solid tools. And I know you guys have heard me talk a lot about these, and it really has changed the speed of the way I model. So I really want you guys to learn solid tools and how to model with solid tools. And as we go through, this is really one of those things that I'm going to try and explain as much as possible the reasons why I use it and why it speeds things up. So that's going to be more of a discussion across the board of building models, not just today. So every step I go, you'll see why making solids, in my opinion, really makes sense. And really at the end of all of this, even at the end of every class, if anybody has a better way of doing something, that's the whole point of this, is for all of us to get better, not just me getting you guys better, but having a group that we can all discuss things. So starting off with the very, very basics of solids, what makes up a solid? A solid has to be a group, so inside of a container. So I say group, but it can be a component, that's fine. Has to be a group or component. But just because it is a group, it doesn't mean it's solid. And by that, you can see right here, this is all individual pieces. So this is not a group right off the bat. This one here is a group. You can see that clicking it once, it's a group. If I double click it, you can see I can go into the group. But you can also see that this is not a solid because it's not an airtight model. It means that basically you should not see any blue at any point. And theoretically, if I were to fill this cube up with water, I should be able to roll it around and water would not fall out. It's the best way to explain it. So to make this one a solid, and in fact, I'm just going to show a solid. I'm going to pull up my solid commands. It doesn't matter which one yet. You see if I hover over it, hopefully you can see that on your screen. There's a little red does not work sign, and it's telling me it's not a solid. Same thing here, because this one's not a group, so it's not a solid. And same thing here. This one does meet the criteria of, if I were to fill this up and roll it around, water would not escape. It's an airtight cube, but you can also see that this has some errant piece of geometry. So it needs to be a group that holds water and as minimalistic as possible, not have this errant geometry. So for this one, if I select it and I add a face back in and pull up a 3D tool command, you see that that red arrow or that red circle now turns into the number 1, and it's telling me that this is a solid. That is correct. And if I come in here and erase this errant line and come back out, you can see that it's now telling me it's a solid group. One thing to be very aware of is if I hide this, I can no longer see that in there. But if I try to try to act as if this is a solid, it's telling me it's not a solid. And I could look around and that visually I would not be able to figure out why. But if I hit W and turn on hidden geometry, I can realize that there's something in there. I want to delete it out. And now it's telling me this is a solid. So this is the very, very basics of understanding what truly makes up a solid and what doesn't. Thankfully, for all of these issues, in fact, let me undo everything. So I'm going back to where I don't have a face. I have a face missing, and this has an errant line in it. Even if this line, just so you know, is out here in space and not touching this, you can see that this still wouldn't work because it's not truly a solid. Now, what's nice is, and this is going to get into another part of our weekly discussions, that I'm going to try and bring up plugins that we should be using that relate to that week's topics. And each one of those plugins obviously will build on everything as we move forward. So just because we use a plugin for one particular week's topics doesn't mean it can't be used for other stuff. It's just trying to not overwhelm with doing hundreds of plugins all at once, but understanding where plugins come in and why they come in and what they can accomplish. So for this one, there's actually three really important plugins that really helps with working with solids. And actually, as a side note, everybody has a pro version now, so you have solid tools at your disposal. And if you don't see them up there, I mean, this is the solid tools box. If you don't already see it up there, if you right click and go to solid tools, you just need to turn it on. So that's where it's located, and you right click anywhere in blank gray area. So that's turning on solid tools, and then going into the extension warehouse. And I'll try and get it to you guys today, but there's going to be a sign-in that I want to use, essentially a generic one for all of us. And the reason why that will really work is it keeps a track as to what should be installed, and I think in the future it'll make it easier for every SketchUp to be kept the same. So I'll get you everybody the proper login that I want everybody to use. And if you've already installed extensions, it doesn't matter. You can still sign out with whatever you have previously signed in and sign in with the new one. So I'll try to get that to everybody by the end of the day. But the first one is going to be cleanup. In fact, I think it's cleanup 3, just to be more specific. So in Extension Warehouse, if you search for cleanup 3, it's this one right here by Thom. He writes a ton of scripts, and I use a lot of them. And if you click on it, just a thing to note, when you go to download and install it, you'll see that it has a requirement of this TT library. It's just a background extension that some of his extensions require to use. So you just need to install that one as well, and it'll let you know that. So the cleanup, in fact, I'm going to show you the other ones real quick too before I get into talking about them. The other one is a fantastic one called Solid Inspector. So those issues that I was running into, they were pretty easy to find as to why they weren't solids, but there's obviously much more complex geometry that we'll get into. Whoops. that gets to be much, much more difficult to figure out why something isn't properly working. And that's where these come in. So there's actually two. He has Solid Inspector, which is the original one, and then he created a second one called Solid Inspector 2. For the most part, Solid Inspector 2 is the only one you're really going to use, but install both because there's a few instances that using this one really helps, and I'll show that in a second. So you just want to install both, and I believe this one, the Solid Inspector, requires that same TT library, but once you install it for one and it's already there, you don't need to install it every time. So those are the three, the cleanup 3, Solid Inspector 1, and Solid Inspector 2. And what those do, let's start with cleanup. The reason why I really love this thing is I like keeping very, very clean geometry. So say I have this rectangle here and it's split down the middle. As you guys know, this here is split and not one full line, where a lot of times we really want that to be full. And it doesn't always happen, but if I erase this, sometimes this line will stay split. Sometimes it heals itself, which is good. But in just in case it does stay split, like this, you can see that if I were to push-pull this, it creates this line right down the middle, which, as we talked about, if I were to make this a group, you can see that this can start creating issues with like errant geometry being in there. And so we just really want to keep geometry as clean as possible. So the clean command, I actually have, again, as surprisingly, a shortcut to it. But if you go to extensions and then cleanup, you can go, the first time you use it, you'll use this one, this clean. And basically it has a whole bunch of settings, but the ones that I typically leave it as is, but there's a few that I change. I can't remember what the basic ones are, but the ones that are important to me are erase stray edges and repair split edges, and merge coplanar faces. So if you have two faces sitting on top of each other, it'll actually merge them together and help clean up your geometry. And this will erase stray edge, repair split edges. So those two are under edges. And then under, where is it? Coplanar faces. I do merge coplanar faces. This one here, ignore UV. I think I'm going to start messing with that a little more, because if you guys don't know what UV is, it's just the positioning of your textures. In fact, I'm just going to show you a quick example just so we're all on the same page. So if I were to add in a brick material, and this brick material, if I were to change the direction, that means this one has a different UV mapping, so it has different coordinates than this one. Where if I were to clean this, this is saying ignore UV mapping. So if I come here, go to cleanup, it'll actually get rid of that. And hopefully this is going to work. I think that's what this ignore UV is. So if I say clean up, see how it gets rid of that line and it makes it both the same direction. I actually don't like that, because I want it. There could be reasons why I want the brick to run this way in this one and the brick to run that way in that one. So really this one here will be an important one as well, of deselecting ignore UV. So this way when I clean up, it keeps that line because I want it. That makes sense? Everybody following? Okay, so so what's really nice is, again, if I have this, you can see this edge is broken. Even if I have this straight line, I have all kinds of straight line, even if this one is hidden. That's why you should never draw in space. There we go. So I have all this is obviously very not clean geometry. If I select this and I go to extensions, clean up, I go clean last settings. So you can do clean every time, but once you have those settings selected, you shouldn't ever have to go back in it. You can just do clean with last settings, and the clean with last settings is the one that you can make a hotkey for. And again, just to quickly look at it, window preferences, I can type in clean, and so you can see this one right here, clean with last settings. I use the tilde key, which is the one that's just to the left of number 1. So it's a single key, very easy to hit, very top left key. So I can just select everything, I hit that key, and in that one keystroke, you can see that everything was erased that was not necessary for this plane. So I use that all the time in my modeling. It's almost become second nature. The same way I hit Control S for save, probably way more than I ever need to. Right after I draw something, I hit that clean button, and it just makes sure that every piece of geometry I draw is clean. And it's just one of those things that the more you use it, the more you understand why, and you'll get your own rhythm of using it. So that's the clean command, and it's such a fantastic one, and it's one everybody should have and should be using. Now be careful with it, because say I have some random geometry out here, and I have random geometry in here, and all I want to do is clean this. So I'm selecting everything, and I click my hotkey, and it cleans it. Now, if I wanted to clean this and I did not have it selected, it'll actually review the complete entire model and do a clean. So without anything selected, if I hit that button, you can see that both of those go away. That makes sense? So it's one of those things that you just need to be very, very aware, because especially of a very large model, it can take a decent amount of time to go through and process everything, and even things that you don't want processed. So just be very clear in what you're selecting and what you want cleaned. All right, so that's the clean tool, very, very important one. The next one is using your cleanup or your solid inspector, 1 and 2. And again, I usually start with 2, and I have a hotkey. That's actually not one. As F3. Because there's actually icons you can have up there for them. If you're an icon person, they're easy to put up there. In fact, I think they're on here somewhere. If not, they're easy to get up there. But I use F2 for cleanup 1 and F3 for cleanup 2. It's a little confusing, but F1 is help, and you can't change that. So if I hit F3, it's going to bring up this dialog box where this is why it's not working. It's saying surface border, and you click info and say that it's basically missing a mesh. This one cannot be auto fixed. You have to actually go in and fix it. So if you can't find where it is, this one's obviously very, very obvious. But in fact, let me do this. So from this perspective, it looks like a solid, and there's no reason why this shouldn't work. But if I hit F3, I copied the command, that's why it works. But you can see, so when it's a real box, it says no errors, everything is working. But if I come in, everything says shiny. So if I erase the bottom, and I can't see the bottom, and if I hit F3 to run it, it'll say there's an issue, and you can see that it's highlighting where it is. Sometimes the highlight is really small or really hard to find, and that's why I like his original cleanup. If I hit F2, or not cleanup, excuse me, solid inspector, his original solid inspector, you can see it's making this huge red circle that as I move around, it's really highlighting where that error is. Again, probably 98% of the time I use his cleanup 2. So if I select this one and I hit my F3, which is my shortcut that I made, it'll say this has a straight edge, and that's why it's not a solid. But this time it's saying, do I want to fix it? If I hit fix, it actually erases it, which is super nice. His original one, if I hit F2, you can see that it highlights it, but all it's doing is highlighting it. I have to physically go in and delete it. But that's why his second one is so much better, is I can actually fix it. You know, in fact, if I have, all kinds of issues, I can turn this face inside out. And again, like I said, you're supposed to never see blue in solids. If I hit F3, it's now telling me there's 3 stray edges and a reversed face. And I can go through and individually select them, or I can just say fix all. And you can see it gets rid of those stray edges and reverses that face to make it proper. Say that again. When I'm doing roofs? Using the follow me command? Exactly. Like exactly. So, more specifically, I think what you're asking when you're making very complex 3D, objects, especially roofs, especially because roofs at the very beginning when I got into this were by far the hardest thing to do. But I feel like I've come up with a technique that really makes it easy. But it's easy because of all these basic tool sets that I'm teaching now, um, that really help prevent the issues that came up when I initially did them. Being able to clean things very quickly, finding out where and how things are not solids, and using solids to build and inferencing and all that good kind of stuff. And we're definitely going to get into roofs pretty heavy in a little bit. But and I think to your question, um, almost on a general standpoint, these tools that I'm showing you right now, the solid inspectors and the cleanup tools, can be used across the board in everything we're going to do from day one to the very last day. That these are just such foundational tools to help better modeling from the very beginning. If I, so you're asking if I punch a hole in it, will it still be a solid? And the answer is it depends on how you punch the holes. And right, and we're actually going to get very deep into that very specific question when we get into windows and doors, um, because there's a very specific way I model because of the question you're asking, and I really still to this day wrestle on going back and forth of the best way of doing it. But to more simply answer your question, if I were to push this in, say 8 inches, to give a recess for a window to sit in, this will still be a solid. I mean, there's no reason why. I could put water in it, shake it around, and water would not come out. In fact, if I hit F3, you can see it says everything is shiny, no errors. If I were to delete this so that I can see into my model, you can see that this is now no longer a solid because it's missing that face. If I were to push this all the way through to the other edge, now we're back to where if I go to X-ray mode, there's no reason that this should not be a solid, because I can fill, if I hide this, I can fill all this up with water up to the edge, put the top on it, and water would be stuck in it. It's a watertight model. So if I hit F3, you can see it's still telling me that it's a solid, that everything is shiny, which gets into why I model the way I do for Windows. And I'm going to just do a quick demonstration because it's getting close to 1 and we're going to finish up really soon. Quick demonstration on why I do the windows that I do, because if I make this a group, this is a solid. It's perfect. If I were to come in here and in fact, you know what? I'm gonna make a, oops, delete this. I'm just gonna make a window real quick. So I just exploded it, just so you know. And if fact, I'm going to push this. I'm going to make a copy of this because this is my 8-inch wall. So this is as if I was building walls, and this is as if I was building an eggshell model. You know, so it's literally just the outside, not wall thicknesses or anything like that. You know, everything what we call a Mitch model. If I were to come in here and push this in 8 inches, select all this, make component, and say cut opening, and click create. So now, just like windows you've seen before, I can move this wherever because it's cutting a hole in the model. And even though theoretically, if I grab all of this and say make this a group, oops, grab something I didn't want to. If I grab all of this, turn it into a group, and theoretically this passes the water tightness test, that everything inside of here will be watertight. This component in here actually acts as the same way a straight edge acts. So if I hit F3, you can see that this has a nested instance. So therefore, this is causing an issue for this to be a solid, which is why now when I model, I punch this hole out. In fact, if I come in here, I'm going to copy this window, say move it here, and then I'll come back in and draw a second square and run this through, punch it out. I can actually turn this into a solid where the window cuts out, and then this is my window that sits inside of it. So I lose that capability of being able to move my window wherever I want, but I gain the capability of allowing this to be a solid. Does that make sense? Did that long explanation answer your question? Okay. It does and it doesn't. And that's where we can get into later the other plugin. So in general, if I want to move this window, it's a two-step process. If I want to move this 12 inches to the right, I move the window, come into the group, and move this. And if I happen to have trims or anything else, you know, I have to go into multiple groups and move it. And yes, it makes it a longer process. But I also have this tool, this stretch by area. I can, outside of everything, I can grab this and say move 24 inches, and it actually moves both at the same time. So without a doubt, there's always going to be pros and cons to everything we do in the way we model. And that's why throughout this course, I want to talk about, you'll be very transparent as to why I made decisions to do what I do. Because even though this is very easy to move a window, it's more difficult for me to edit this box than it would be for me to edit the other model. Probably in the last 2 years, 2 or 3 years, I've been doing this method. Yeah. Yeah. Right. It is extra steps, but those extra steps are fairly minimal. Right. 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 Yeah. Just to have great ways of selection sets and whatnot. What was I going to say? I'm going to go through solid tools. I have some quick demonstrations on all the different solid tools. Oh yeah, what I was going to say before I move on. So part of this is I'm going to show you, in my opinion, the best way to model a house, to do what we do here at Affinity. Now, two things on that. It's an ever-changing process. Like, with the way I modeled is different from the year before and different from the year before. There's always new plugins, always new ways of thinking about things, always problem solving. And that's the idea, is that we're all continually getting better and better. And the quicker I bring everybody else up to speed and they're attacking things and they're finding problems and ways around it, the better we're all going to get. And that's really the goal to this whole thing. But with that said, even though what I'm showing you, in my opinion, is the best way to model, it also depends. You need to be aware as to what the intent of your model is. So when I say this is the best way to model, it's the best way to model and get the most out of your model. So from the way I'm telling you how to model, you're going to be able to do renderings super easy. You're going to be able to take extract information to do construction drawings very easily. You know, you're going to have a plethora of information built into this model that you know, we use on Brian's side all the time and really speed up the productivity of our office. With that said, if you know you're in the very early process, you know, and working with Mitch, and all you're trying to do is literally just make a sketch, then doing an eggshell model, you know, what we all call a Mitch model, probably makes the most sense. You can just do. So ultimately what I'm telling you is you need to find the best way to work for what your goal is. What I'm showing you is probably the more advanced way that we use, say, 90% of the time in the office. Does that make sense? All right. So real quick, so last thing before we head out of class, and I can provide this file to you guys to show you, you know, that has all the stuff on here that you can play with. So if I go to subtract, so there's 6 different ways that you can use solid tools. The outer shell is actually part of the free version, the make version, but the other 5 are part of Pro. So the first one let's look at is subtract. So you see I have these two cubes, right? And depending on what you call selection 1 and selection 2, different things will happen. So you can see I have 2 different results out here. This one was selecting this one first, and this one was selecting this one first. And by that I mean, if I select my subtraction tool, I select number 1, and you can see next to my arrow there's a number 1 sign. If I select that as my number 1, that's going to be my cutting box. That's going to be the piece that gets taken away. And my number 2 is what I want left. So I'm going to select number 1, and then I'm going to select number 2. And you can see that that cut out that piece, which is what happened right here. Now, if I were to reverse that and say, make this my number 1 and this my number 2, you can see it just did the opposite, which is what this is. Make sense? Okay, so moving on to trim. This will do the exact same thing as subtract, except if I were to subtract, and I'm doing subtract, not trim right now. If I subtract this from this, you see this gets deleted out. If I do trim, now this time it doesn't, it does matter because actually, let me see here. Yeah, it does matter still which one is your 1 and which one is your 2. So trim does the exact same thing, except it does not delete the box. So you can see here, this is my number 1 and this is my number 1 on this side. So if I select trim, I'm going to trim number 1 from number 2. You can see that it did the same thing that the subtraction tool did, but this box didn't go away. So it does the exact same thing, except it just doesn't delete the box out. That's the only difference. Make sense? So split is again similar, but what this will do, this one is indifferent as to which one is number 1 and which one is number 2. Because what this is going to do is, it'll, wherever the 2 solids connect, it creates a third piece of geometry. So this one I've already done it, and this one I did one here and one here. But you can see it's the exact same thing. If I move this piece of geometry and move this piece of geometry, you can see that it left this cube where they intersected. And it was indifferent as to which one is 1 and which one is 2. So if I split this from this, you can see that it leaves me with all 3 pieces having been edited. Make sense? If not, speak up. Now, intersect, it does the same thing, that it creates that same cube. This is that same cube that's here. See how these are the exact same cubes? So split and intersect do the exact same thing, except this time intersect will delete your number 1 and your number 2. And it only leaves you with the intersecting piece. Makes sense? So union, so the last two, we have union and outer shell. And union and outer shell are going to do very, very similar things. And in fact, maybe I'll show you both at the same time. So I have union and I have outer shell. And I have, what I did here is I made exterior walls, interior walls, and a roof. And it's the exact same model here. If I'm going to put the top back on so that this is essentially one complete solid. If I go to X-ray mode, you can see the interior walls, exterior walls, and the roof, right? If I select everything, so I have interior, exterior, and roof, and I do my union, what it's going to do is combine everything. So now everything is combined as one solid, but if I hide, you see that I'm left with interior walls, exterior walls, and roof, but it's all one solid. See that? And you can see that if I go to my solid commands, or hit my solid inspector, it's not liking the interior faces. I don't think it can actually fix it. Yeah, it is. Yeah, in fact, if I union everything, you can see if I put this next to it, I can combine this with this and it works because it's telling me it's a solid. So that's union. Now outer shell, just like it sounds, really I think the better name is eggshell. So if I select everything and click outer shell, all it's going to do is find the outermost shell. So even though right now these two look identical, what's going to happen if I hide this, you see it got rid of every single thing except for what was necessary to keep an outer shell. Make sense? So if I put these two next to each other, you can see that this one deleted all the interior pieces because it didn't need it for the eggshell, versus this one created a union of all this stuff. So that's all 6 solid tools. And to be honest, with that said, getting to know all of them is great. The subtraction tool and the union tool are really the ones that I use the most. And in fact, those are really the only ones I use. I would say 99% of the time between those two, those are the ones I use. Like if I'm making a foundation, I have my foundation, and I turn that into a group, and I come in here, offset this 8 inches, and I turn, make these walls. So that's how I'll start. So I have my foundation, my exterior walls, and then eventually I'll come back in and combine those together to make one complete model. Oh, it is. And for the longest time in my models, I'll leave them separated as long as I possibly can. And if you've ever worked with Mitch, he hates those horizontal lines where if a full wall is supposed to look like a full wall, even though there's splits to it, he doesn't want to see that. So there's, you know, it's a matter of just balancing the proper way of working and working with Mitch. Um, this is really just, again, a very basic lesson as to how solid tools work, and these are going to be the foundations of the way I want you guys to work moving forward. And we're really going to get heavy into these over the next 2 classes, and really specifically next class. But this is yeah, so this is just really key, and they're really fun things to play with. I mean, you can make super advanced organic shapes that would be very difficult to do otherwise. You know, if I do something like this and turn that into a group, you know, rotate this thing around, you know, whatever it is, maybe I'll scale it a little bit so make it go through. We should maybe even scale, oops. I'm going to scale this. Oh, there we go. Just so I have this really funky shape. I mean, you can see that I can easily subtract this out of this, and how long that would have taken to draw by hand. I mean, like I said, you can just get some really cool shapes by using these solid tools. So yes, what's that? Yeah, exactly. So if you ever want to do Frank Gehry stuff or whatever. So yeah, I'll create a folder on the server that I'll start putting all this stuff in as we go, and it could even be a good place for us to save our projects that we're working on, so we have them all there and we can all look at each other's work. And I'll let you guys know where that is. So anyway, that's today. Next week, I want to get into the way that I import AutoCAD, what I import from AutoCAD, start making basic massing using solid tools for your houses. As well as we've done it a little bit already previously, you know, but going over what all these scene tabs and kind of the generic basic setup of SketchUp. You know, how I use things, why I have certain layers, why I have certain scenes, and how all those relate to each other. So we'll attack all that next week. Yeah, we are next Thursday, and then we'll be doing every other week after that. Yeah, so between now and next week, ideally you guys would have a project you want to work on, so that when we go through the project massing lesson, you guys can jump right in to start massing out your project. Yeah, that's all I want you guys to do. If you want to play around with the solid tools, just to get familiar with them and what they do and that sort of stuff, that'd be great. But just pick a project, and it doesn't. Again, you can make it whatever you want. It could be a project. Yeah, and in fact, I mean, so yeah, so have fun, select whatever project you want to work on, and you know, as you run into problems, I mean, the idea is to create problems so that we can solve them in this process, so that when you're actually working on a project, we minimize that. Yep, you got it, guys. All right, thanks, guys. Talk to you later.